Okay, it's 4 o'clock. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We're at the What's Your Function? Paraeducator Recertification webinar. So my name is Sarah Kleesner with AEA. I'm a school social worker out of the Delhi office. I serve the Western Dubuque School District, primarily at Drexler Middle School in Farley. I'm also on the Behavior Resource Team.
And I'm Cole Trimble. I'm a school social worker and currently serve the Oelwein School District, Starmont School District. I'm also on the Behavior Resource Team that serves the greater portion of Northeast Iowa with Sarah. A couple things I also wanted to go over with you before we get started was welcome this afternoon, this evening. I also wanted to remind you that you can only hear us, we can't hear you. So if you have any questions, and hopefully you do throughout this process, if you could ask your questions on the chat screen on the left-hand side where you're signing in, we have another computer set up here, so we'll be able to see that, and we'll respond to those questions as they come in. At least acknowledge that they're here, that we have them, and maybe we'll answer them at a later time or a better time. But please feel free to ask any questions that come up throughout this. We have a lot of information that we've condensed into this slide presentation, and hopefully we'll be discussing some specifics and not just the general terms that we're going to be going over and trying to introduce you to some new ideas. Some of you might have seen or at least heard if you've been in any presentations with Sarah or I, but we definitely try to add a bunch of stuff to this presentation. And with no other further ado, we're going to start our presentation here. I don't see any questions or concerns so far, so we'll just hopefully start right in here. Okay. A report of 6 studies on school staff burnout gave us the top 10 reasons of why school staff feel burnout. This report and a couple other ones that we are going to be talking about today were done in 2008, 2009. And if you Google staff burnout, attrition within schools, most of the information that you will find are from the year 2008, 2009. There's no current data within the last 2 years. That's extremely difficult to find any real good, reliable data that's recently been posted out there. The 10th reason is low self-efficacy. Basically, the beliefs in one's ability. Oftentimes, people don't feel like they have enough training, or they're in the right place. Number 9 reason is low decision authority. That's basically not feeling like you have a say in the classroom setting. I often, when working with paraprofessionals, I hear that their thought is that they have good ideas, good thoughts about what needs to be done, but they don't necessarily have a good relationship with that teacher or feel comfortable with that. The number 8 in this study is lack of job resources. Basically, what you come on the job with is what you have, and vice versa. If you no learning opportunities basically at hand. Number 7, the mental and emotional load. And I know I'm speaking to the choir when I say most oftentimes are difficult children that we get to deal with on a day in and day out basis. We know exactly who takes care of a lot of their needs and oversees the process, and that's the paraprofessionals within the buildings. Number 6 is the pace and amount of work and demands. I know we all feel it. At the end of your job title, it says, and all other duties that are assigned. That it just seems like we get overwhelmed and oftentimes can be overloaded. And later on in this presentation, we'll talk about some ways to de-stress, and I think we're going to touch on some different areas that deal with that. Number 5 is the sense of defeat, and I think that strictly correlates with number 6, the amount of work and demands and not being able to relieve those stresses, and sometimes not always being able to see the successes of a child you might deal with. different scenarios are working with students in the mornings, working with them for only 1 year, and then they move on. I know having the opportunity to work in different settings, different classrooms, different buildings, in the elementary, middle school, and high school, the amount of success that I see kids progress with, and after a para might have worked with that student in 4th grade, and now I see him as a junior or a sophomore in high school, the amount of success that they've had, and none of that's relayed back to the other staff. Number 4, perceived loss of status. Number 3, sense of low status. Basically, your thoughts and ideas aren't taken seriously, or you don't feel like you have a voice. Number 2, interactions with colleagues. Oftentimes, I see this as not having enough interaction with colleagues, not being able to meet as a group. I know most districts that I participate in and work with, that on the Wednesday early outs, or some districts do it on Monday early outs, that there's not time set aside necessarily for the paras to be able to get together, basically debrief, talk about different student needs, ideas that they have. A lot of times it's centered around teacher professional development, and not necessarily just paraprofessional development. And the number 1 reason is discipline problems. The school staff burnout. I don't think that was any surprise to anybody that's out there listening. So good. It's just not a surprise to anybody out there. Nationwide, 20% of new teachers, professionals working within the school system, leave teaching within 3 years. 17% of those leave after the first year of being employed by the school district. Now think about all the training that we go through to work with kids. Sorry, Sarah is she's messing with my screen and
Trying to figure out how to advance ours and advance yours at the same time.
Think about all the time and resources you put into going into the classroom setting and working and helping both colleagues and students. And 17% people leave after the first year, and 1 out of 5 people leave after 3 years. And one more statistic that I wanted to throw out here is that more than 50% of new staff members within the school system leave the profession within 5 years. Now that number is outrageous to begin with, but think about the turnover that we have, and it's great to have new ideas and new thoughts, but it's also on one end of the spectrum, but on the other end of the spectrum, to have people that have been a part of that school system, have resources, have roots within that school system. I mean, that's the biggest part is of having new, fresh thoughts and new ideas. And to say that every 5 years that we're going to lose half of our staff, I mean, that's unthinkable. Now, we can all think of people who have been in the profession for 20, 25, 30 years, and that's great, and they're a great resource to us when we walk into a school building. I mean, they know what's worked and what hasn't worked, but they're very few and far between if you look around. All right, one other statistic I wanted to put out here is also dated 2008, 2009. This came out of USA Today, one of those snapshots that are on the bottom left-hand side of the paper every day. And this talked about violence in schools. Among K-12 teachers, the percentage of who say that these things have occurred within their school setting within the last school year, which is 2008, 2009. First one they talk about is verbal confrontations. 76% of the people in schools said that this occurred within their school building. 65% of them saw fights within the school building. 36% of them had felt that staff were abused by the students. And I don't know how they defined abused by students. I'm assuming that the lack of respect, walking out of the classroom, not following directions, not following their classroom rules. 28% is a student that had a weapon at school, some sort of weapon that was taken to school. And 16% or none of the above felt that any of these occurred. I have the opportunity. To work in and out of several of the 24 school districts that Keystone AEA is a part of. And probably the one thing that really surprises me the most here is that 16% of the people in this study said that none of the above happened. Because most every school that I have the opportunity to go work with, um, any staff person I talk to, I'd have to think that that percentage might be closer to 3 to 5%. And I'd feel confident saying 95% of the people that I talk to and work with on a daily basis within the school systems have seen one or more of the above. So I don't know if it's. I can't believe that if this is Iowa, that this would be above in percentages. But I have a feeling if you think about if you've been one of the 50% that have worked over the last 5 years, that these stats have really probably progressed immensely over that time, and that it might have been an accurate picture 5 years ago, but in today's world, that we're seeing a lot more. And we turn the page to the in-service objectives. Hopefully, we cover this and a few other things, but at the minimum, these are the areas that we're going to definitely cover over the next hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. First thing is we're going to define what behavior is and is not. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to define function versus non-function. We're going to give you examples, and we're going to really kind of dive into what an actual function of a behavior is in a lot more detail. I know Sarah is going to be giving you a case example of walking you through the process. The third one is discussing components of functional behavioral assessment with the case example. And the last one is effective behavioral strategies for all students. And this is just trying to think. It's going to be some areas. I'm going to discuss some areas that aren't necessarily new to you by any means, but hopefully refreshes, give you some ideas, and with people's input, typing in here, that we can maybe get a little more specific. I'd like to say that I don't want to necessarily start with specific case examples. Because every case, every scenario, every environment, personality is going to differ, and that way, that'll give us, and that way we won't spend a large amount of time on one specific issue. If it is an issue you want to talk to or talk about with like the behavior resource team, please get a hold of your core team member, and we can discuss it that way. So. If you would turn to the next page, as Sarah is ready to begin the underlying assumptions about behavior.
When we talk about some assumptions about behavior, we know that behavior is learned. Behavior happens because it can. If we think about things such as speeding, we speed because we can. We tend to not do that behavior in a spot where we know that the officer often sits. Or if we think about how we deal with stress and conflict, we behave that way because we can. Another assumption is that behavior serves a specific purpose. Behavior gets us what we want. Think about a child's temper tantrum and what that ends up getting them. Behavior is related to the context in which it happens. In what situations or under what conditions does the behavior occur and not occur? A good example here would be that church behavior, which is true for kids and adults. When we're sitting in our place of worship, we would never think of making an ugly face, saying unkind words, or using single-digit sign language. Yet when we're on the highway and that big truck pulls in front of us or stops in front of us, the first thing we do, we make an ugly face, we say unkind words, and some of us just may resort to single-digit sign language. But the good news is that behavior is functional. A student can learn that appropriate behavior can be effective in producing the outcome that they desire. It can be predictable. By looking at antecedents and consequences that set up and maintain behavior, behavior can be predictable. And it's changeable. Behavior intervention has two goals: to not only reduce the problem behavior, but to increase the appropriate behavior. We also know that behavior is definitely not random. When we look at behavior, we kind of look at what we call the ABCs. So we look at those antecedents, those things that happen prior to a behavior. the actual behavior, and the consequences. So what happens after the behavior. So some examples might be, so mom's talking on the phone with grandma, and Johnny decides to do some kind of disruptive behavior. He throws a toy at her, he pulls on her pant leg, whatever he's doing to get her attention. And the consequences, so the result of that, is that mom's going to hang up the phone. So his behavior, pulling on her pant leg, throwing the toy, gets him his desired consequence, or his desired reaction of mom hanging up the phone. In a classroom setting or a daycare setting, if peer has a preferred toy, the child grabs the toy away from them, they get to play with the toy. If that same child takes the toy back, then you might tell the teacher, and the teacher gets the toy back. One that we probably all can attest to, either have seen or probably been a part of yourself if you've taken your own children to the grocery store. The child sees the candy that they so conveniently put in the checkout line, wants the candy. So the behavior they exhibit is some sort of tantrum behavior, anything from I want that to the kicking and screaming. And the consequence often is dad gives them that candy. So that behavior was definitely not random. That child had an intent in mind, and
I want to touch on that for behavior is not random slide, the one back. Sorry about that, Sarah. Some of you have probably been asked to collect data for one or more people. If you're working in the districts that I'm in, I've probably asked you on occasion to look at the antecedent behavior, the consequence. And basically, in a nutshell, the best way I understand it is, I guess relay it is, when we're looking at behavior in general, we're looking at, okay, the antecedent, okay, what is happening at that time that the behavior occurs, and when the behavior occurs, how do they act to get what they want? Consequences are positive and negative, and sometimes that's confusing, and because most of us think it's the consequences are negative, and not necessarily. And when we're talking with you today about different functions and using some terminology, that consequences can be either positive or negative. In this case, we're definitely talking about positive for them, most oftentimes negative for you and I, just because it's happening to us. And so when we talk about ABC data, if you ever hear that terminology, this is exactly what they're talking about. They're trying to find out the antecedent of what's happening, where are they at, the behavior that they demonstrate in order to receive their positive consequence. So I just want to just be clear with that, so everybody's on the same page.
You flip to the next slide, then we're going to start talking about those functions of behavior. And when we look at the function of a behavior, so what purpose does that behavior meet? We have three basic functions. We're going to talk about access, escape, and automatic. So that first one is access. So this is looked at as positive reinforcement. So they want to get something. They want access to something. Some examples of that might be social attention. So they want access to their peers or one particular peer. They may want access to an adult or a group of adults. They may want access to specific material, so more of a tangible kind of access function where they want certain activities or certain preferred things. We certainly work with students who have highly preferred activities that they would much rather do, and so that behavior serves the function of wanting them to have access to that. A third one might be that sensory stimulation. This is often a tricky one that we talk about. We're going to talk about this sensory stimulation, this automatic stuff, a little bit throughout each of the functions. So if we look at access to that sensory stimulation, one thing that I probably see often in some students is they may want access to that movement. Student has a difficult time sitting in their desk or sitting at group time on the carpet for as long as they need to. And so some of those wiggly behaviors or touching other kids, some of those behaviors, the function of that would be to gain access to that movement or to have a little more flexibility in what they're doing. The next one is escape. So this is more of that negative reinforcement. So to avoid something or to get away from something. Some examples might be to escape a work or a task, so some sort of activity. Often in the school setting, we see this in regards to academic type things. So It could be all academics in general, or it might be more specific. Sometimes we might see those behaviors more occur in math or in reading, that they might differentiate it that way.
The example that I often see in schools, in fact I saw it today, and yes I was in one building today, is we're going to use for an example is if you're in math class, and Cole here doesn't like math very well, so there's a lot of things I can do to escape math, because I know if I do certain things, like if I stand up and yell at my friend, or if I throw a pencil across, or if I really have to push the envelope and tell you where to go, or tell you what I think of you, as a teacher, or as a parent, or as an adult within the building. I mean, most kids don't want to go to that point, but they know what it takes in order to get out of that setting. So for me to get out of the setting, if I don't have my math worksheet done, and I show up, and the first thing I do is push my friend, and I can't do that, otherwise I get sent to the office. Well, hey, bonus for me, I just escaped math class, because I'm going to drag my feet all the way to the office. I'm going to use the restroom. I'm going to be belligerent or defiant if I need to whoever is taking care of that that behavior, if it's a principal or vice principal, or if you have a liaison that's working with that student. And hopefully, if with any luck, I'm going to blow 40 or 50 minutes, and I have lunch next, so I'm out of math. Now tomorrow is a new day, and I'm going to learn. I'll figure out a way to blow out of math tomorrow if I want to. But behaviors happen for a reason, and all these are really important functions to think about. But I see escape an awful lot, and for a variety of different reasons, and hopefully we'll get into those if they have some good questions. But it's not always because Cole wants to. Cole does things for a reason. It's not always because he's just naughty. Cole could do it because of a variety of different reasons. And each thing, like I said, this is the specifics of your environment, your settings, and things that you really have to try to pick out. Sort of like layers of an onion. You peel back things until we find out what makes those people click. And so, just because somebody gets kicked out of your class on an occasion, you really need to sit there and look at, okay, why is he trying to escape my class? What is it that he's not getting that everybody else is getting?
Another example might be that they might want to escape certain people. So whether it be peers or adults or a group, often we will see students when it's that academic, particularly if it's a difficult academic area for them, that when they get in that large group environment, their behavior might increase because they want to escape that environment. They're not comfortable in that environment. They know that it's more difficult for them, and they don't want their peers to see that it's difficult for them. Again, we're going to talk about that sensory when we look at the escape. So we certainly have all worked with students who they want to avoid specific environments. I know a lot of students who that lunchroom environment is just traumatic for them. It's noisy, there's lots of lights, there's just a lot of stuff going on in some of those environments. And so we might see an increase in certain behaviors for them to get out of that environment. Certainly sometimes there may be pain. Often some of these sensory things, regardless of what function we're looking at, might be hard for all of us to figure out because it's something that the student knows or the child knows, and we may not be able to easily figure out. The third function is that automatic function. This one is definitely less common than the other two. Sometimes it might be the first one that people might go to. Oh, they can't help it. They're doing that behavior. They can't help it. When in actuality, it might be one of the other functions. We talked about sensory under both the access and the escape, that they might have those type of things going on. But a true automatic function has that automatic reinforcement. So it's maintained by non-social reinforcers. It's going to be those internal things to a student that has nothing to do with anything going on around them or any of those kind of things. So the examples might be some of those true sensory issues. A lot of students that I've worked with, if they've got seizures, certainly if there's some seizure activity going on, it's going to be difficult for them to truly control their behavior, and some of those things that we would have put in place normally are not going to be beneficial for the student. Kind of along that same line is a brain injury, whether that brain injury is caused by a seizure, from a blunt force, that's been damage to the brain. So that's, again, something that is internal to the student and is kind of beyond their control. Some of these behaviors may happen not necessarily by choice.
I'd like to add here also, kind of give an example of a non-automatic function. Had the opportunity to work in a school district. It was last year, and we had a diagnosis of an automatic function, and we, long story short, we tested it out to see if it was actually an automatic function, if it was an escape function, if it was an attention function, or if it was any mixture of any of those. And basically, the scenario was the students would be in specific classes, would start to get irritated. The thought was that they needed the true sensory issues, so they had a bag of sensory items that they were able to go into a room with the lighting that was calm, with their paraprofessional, and able to work out the stress and frustration of the sensory issues. And then once the child was able to gain control from their automatic function, then they'd be able to go back to the classroom and then continue on. Working with the child and testing different things was that we actually found out that the child was not only was it not an automatic function, it was also it was an attention and escape function. And I'll explain. Basically, the child didn't like a specific class, and he liked attention from others, especially the paraprofessional that was able to work with him in that class setting. So he knew that if he acted up to a point of being a disturbance to the other classes, he would be removed to play with these toys, these sensory items, which basically were toys to him, and he was able to receive one-on-one attention in a classroom setting until he felt until basically his glass was filled up to the point of that he had enough attention. He didn't need to escape that class anymore, and he was willing to go back. And so it was, I mean, from my perspective, from our team's perspective, that was a misdiagnosis, and that we could really control if we gave him that attention and we worked with him through that subject matter, that the automatic function disappeared. So it's important to we create a hypothesis through this stuff, we come up with an idea, but importantly to really follow through and to weed out what we think is true, and because what we normally see for face value isn't always what comes about it. So I just want to give you an example of a non-automatic function. Automatic functions do exist by all means. I'm not discrediting that at all. I've seen numerous cases, but like Sarah said, oftentimes we like to look at that first because we feel like it's an automatic function, and we just really need to test out to see what really the function is before we put our finger on it.
Yeah, and sometimes even just ruling out some of those other things is just as valuable information as proving it. So if we test some of these things out when we're doing our thing, sometimes it's just as valuable to us to be able to say, nope, it's not that. And I know in working, if any of you have worked with any of our occupational therapists in the agency, they often are the ones that help us kind of with some of those strategies when it is a true automatic function. But they often, and almost each time now, will have us involved before they even give some of those suggestions and some of those strategies to make sure that it is a true automatic function, that there aren't other things going on.
Now this next slide, the non-functions, you're going to have to continue to click to see exactly what Sarah is talking about. Otherwise, it's going to look like a blank screen.
Yep, so each line is a new click. So Cole kind of started this conversation when we talk about those non-functions. And I have to say that I think I've had each of these statements given to me when I've asked somebody, okay, why is the student doing what they're doing? So the student wants control, not a function. The student is off task. The student is unmotivated. The student is bad. The student has a diagnosis or a disability. While we certainly don't discredit that that's a part of what might be going on with a student, it's not going to be the sole function of their behavior, regardless of what diagnosis they come to the table with. We need to look at how that presents itself. What does it look like? So they have this diagnosis or this disability. What behaviors are they showing? that we can look at as far as a function. The student has a bad home or family, and the student has previous trauma or experiences. Again, these are things that we have no control over, nor does the student most of the time. But again, with all of these, my follow-up question is always, okay, so tell me what that looks like. The student's off task. That doesn't tell me much of anything, because off task for myself is going to look very different than what Cole's off task is going to look. So I really need to know very specifically, what does that look like? Going on to slide 13. When we look at the response class, so this is the response class of behaviors. The definition for that is that different behaviors serve the same function. So Cole and I, or anybody else at the AEA, when you're talking to us about behaviors or what's going on with a child that you're struggling with their behaviors, you're going to hear us ask often, but tell us what that looks like. What does it look like? And those behaviors, while there might be a whole spectrum of those behaviors, they potentially could serve the same function. And if we look at our response, we want to treat all of the behaviors in a response class. Often when we set up our interventions, we might start with some of those low-level behaviors. A lot of times when you look at the list of behaviors that a student presents with, sometimes those low-level ones, such as blurting out in class, putting your head down, if left alone or if not intervened on, might lead to some of those bigger behaviors like aggression. So we're going to treat all the behaviors in those response class. So if you think about some of the behaviors you see, or that Cole and I have seen for some of those different functions, when we look at a student that might want access to something, some of those behaviors might include blurting out, they might yell, they might invade the space of their peers if they're trying to get that peer's attention. A lot of times we see peers maybe acting silly. That student might act silly around their peers to get their attention. If it's access to something, they might simply take that something that they want. You might see them acting up, like Cole said before with that little sensory bag that the student got to do. Those behaviors were, the purpose was to go get access to those sensory items, or those sensory toys, as Cole called them. If the student is wanting to escape from something, some of those behaviors that we've seen might be they put their head down. They might walk away. Again, they could yell in the same situation. Even students might push their stuff off their desk. Sometimes we have students that get more verbal. They want to escape or avoid that task, and so they're going to verbalize. Like Cole gave the example before when he talked about the student that got kicked out of class. He's going to continue to escalate those behaviors because it's going to get him out of what he doesn't want to do even longer.
And I just to jump in there, we all do things for a reason, and I cannot blame the student for doing something that works for them. If their intent is to get a certain response, and they do something over and over in order to access that, I can't blame them. In fact, I think they're very intelligent. We all do things for certain reasons. I know every one of you out there absolutely love children, love your jobs, couldn't think of anything better to do. But I have a feeling that if you, and I'm being sarcastic, I have a feeling that if there wasn't a little check at the end of every 2 weeks or every month, that you might not have such a skip in your step, or might not be as prone to coming to school every day and taking it head on. That we all do things for a reason, and some things are the right way, and oftentimes, and I see this myself when if I can't take a step back and look at the big picture, that we really need to take into consideration of why they're doing what they're doing, and figure out how we can teach them, because we all really feel, I personally think, and this is just me talking, that oftentimes we think, okay, they have the skill, they're just choosing not to do it, and that's not always the case. Kids aren't born with all these skills, they're taught, and knowing what home life some of these kids come from, what they deal with on a daily basis, everything from hygiene to social skills to you name it, which hand to hold a utensil with, how to hold a utensil. These are the skills that they don't have. They're happy to eat, let alone using the utensil, holding it correctly, and making sure that I'm showing the appropriate social skills while I'm sitting at the luncheon table. So I mean, just things to think about. and that I often start to see. And I know if I'm thinking them, other people are too. Well, hopefully they are as well. I'm not the only lone ranger out there that doesn't always take into consideration. So just something else to think about.
And once we identify that function, then that will be the focus of the intervention. Our intervention is only going to work if we have identified that function. And we know, kind of like Cole alluded to, those behaviors are going to continue to happen if it's working for the student. The student wants to get out of math class, and they know if they show up for math class and do certain behaviors, they're going to get kicked out. As long as that continues to be that consequence, which for that student is a positive consequence because they get to leave the environment they don't want to be in, as long as that continues to happen, that behavior is going to continue. And once we have that function identified is when we can put in that intervention based on that function. If we move on to the next slide, we're going to address just a little bit some PBIS, positive behavior interventions and supports. Many of the schools in our AEA have positive behavior supports implemented in at least some of their schools, if not district-wide. So we just kind of wanted to touch on that a little bit. If we look at kind of the 3 levels, so that core, what all students get is that tier 1. So that universal curriculum that 100% all of the students get. So when we're looking at that in relation to behavior, that could be things like those guidance classes. If it's a PBIS school, the PBIS common area teaching. A lot of schools will do that beginning of the year, mid-year, or those bus evacuations. So those are things that all students are able to have access to and to receive. That second level is that supplemental or tier 2. So that's that targeted group. So typically 10 to 15% of students are going to need that supplemental support. So in relation to behavior, it might be more guidance sessions, whether it be one-on-one or small group, more focused on that specific area of need. It could be homework assistance programs, those kind of things that not everybody is getting. Then that next level, that third level, is that intensive or tier 3. This is much more individualized, and you're looking at only about 5% of the students that are going to need this level of support, this intense level of support. This level is where we're going to look at doing a functional behavior assessment. So we're going to really look at what is the function of this student's behavior so that we can put in place a very individualized behavior plan based on that function to meet this child's needs. Moving on, the components of a functional behavior assessment include things like interviews with the parents, the school personnel, the student itself. So really anybody that has any kind of information or interaction on that student. A file review, to look back over the course of that child's educational career to see, has this behavior always been in place? How has it changed? Are there things that have worked or not worked for the students? Seeing if there's any kind of other supports that they've had in place. Attendance records are very important when we're looking at a behavior. Is this child a student who's in school every day, or are they always tardy? Are they always tardy for certain classes? Do they always leave early? Do they have kind of a pattern of being absent every Monday? Those type of things are going to be important when we're looking at all of this information. Discipline referrals. Schools have different programs or systems that they use for this. Some of our PBIS schools might use PART or SWIFT data to keep track of this. I know my own schools have their own programs that they use. But again, these are referrals, whether it's been classroom handled or been referred to the office or some kind of extra teaching component to it, are very important to look at. We look at the frequency of how often that they're occurring.
This is actually a very critical part that I find is actually not the referrals are happening. There's interventions being taken care of, but actually documentation. Without data, it's hard to move forward. That data not only reflects the frequency of it, the duration of it, how often it happens, when it happens. It really paints a clear picture that a lot of times we don't get with interviews or attendance records. We can really sit down and say, okay, this happens at this time of the day, or this happens at that time of day. And what are things going on there? Are there medication issues that we need to look at? Are there personality conflicts we need to look at? Are there academic concerns that we need to look at? Because it happens at the same time every day or every week. Like Sarah brought up, on Mondays they're always gone. On Fridays, what is it that there might be trying to be escaped out of that? or are they getting more attention somewhere else? Or there could be a variety of different reasons and just things to look at. But I find so oftentimes that we go on and talking and we get a lot of information, but actually that hard data to sit there and look at and identify, okay, this is where we need to start is often missing. So I know how difficult it is, and sometimes some school districts have their data collection on the computer, and the computer's sometimes down, or the sheet that I fill it out in is up at the office. I don't have time to do that right now. I completely understand that, but if we can just collect and we have that information, that oftentimes makes the whole process a lot easier.
Absolutely, because when we look at all of this information, including the next couple things with the classroom observations or maybe some structured assessments, what we really look for is kind of some patterns, some trends. So like Cole said, that very specific data is going to give us some very clear-cut information about the when, the where, some of these behaviors are occurring, to give us an even clearer idea as to what might be going on or why it might be going on. But then we take all of this information from all of these different sources, and what we want to do is we want to kind of have what we call a convergence of data. So based on all of these data sources, all of this information, whether it be some of that informal observations or the very clear-cut attendance records, discipline referrals, and on the next slide, then what we do with that information is we want to develop a hypothesis. So this is, with all of this information, we hypothesize, or we are guessing, I guess might be another word, as to what the function of this student's behavior is. So we're looking at kind of a specific condition, the behavior that occurs given that condition, and what function it might be. So the first kind of line here is kind of a fill-in-the-blank one. So an example would be, so when the teacher is instructing class, Jenny will visit with her neighbors in order to get attention from her peers. This is most likely to happen when she is sitting around her preferred peers. So if you look at how specific that hypothesis is, there's really not much way we would be able to develop such a specific hypothesis without all of that information from the descriptive assessment. So without not only that informal assessment, but also just some of those very clear-cut discipline things or frequency counts that we might ask you to gather. That's really going to say, when this occurs, this is what the student is most likely to do, this is why. And again, some of those settings or those conditions that it's most likely to happen. Sometimes, certainly, students are going to be doing it no matter what the environment is, particularly if it's that automatic function. We're on slide 15 now. So kind of an aha moment. We kind of hit on this a little bit before. When we're developing a behavior support plan, it needs to be developed based on the function of behavior. Not based on reaction, not based on emotion or revenge or what might be found on a website or book. We certainly have all worked with some very well-intended parents who overeducate themselves on Google or on some of those sites. So we need to make sure that when we develop plans that it is always based on the function of behavior. I've certainly been involved in discussions or problem-solving meetings where the behavior plan we have in place is just not working. It's not working. And when we look back and gather that information and maybe do some more specific analysis, we see that we have the function wrong. So most often, if a behavior plan is not working, and if you can say that you have been implementing it with integrity, then we need to take a step back and look at, do we have that function correct? Because without an accurate function, the plan is very difficult for it to be successful.
And I'd like to reiterate right here that you are a very important part of this process and need to be involved in the behavior support plan, in the writing of this support plan, because quite often, most times, you're the ones collecting a lot of the data. You're the one that's in several different environments, different classrooms, excuse me, with that child. You see them in a variety of different settings. And you're an important part to make sure that when writing this plan, that it is done correctly, because you're probably going to be the one that's going to implement the plan most of the time, or at least oversee the plan and making sure it works, and possibly collecting data on is the plan working or not. So for you to be a part of everything else except for creating the behavior support plan doesn't make any sense at all. And if you're not, that's your voice be heard. That you need to be um, a part of this entire process because most oftentimes, like I said at the very beginning, or towards the beginning of this conversation, is that if there's a child, if there's a behavior concern within the school building, who is the one that sees them more often throughout the day than anybody else? And it's you. And so, with that being said, I mean, you know, make sure your voice is heard, and if it's not, find somebody who can help be a voice for you to make sure that you're part of that plan.
And to piggyback on what Cole just said, don't be afraid to ask questions. If you haven't seen the behavior plan of a child that you're working with, ask to see it. If you have a question about, okay, how does that look when I'm in a classroom, ask the question. Your teachers, your AEA, if you're assigned to the building, if there is one that you see frequently, are going to be more than happy to sit down and walk through that with you. I know recently I've had a lot of conversations with some pairs working with some difficult behavioral students, and the plan in place is a good plan, but it's a routine working with this child, and all of us needed to sit down and review the plan and talk about, okay, in this different environment, how is that going to look? How is it going to work? And we made sure that that paraprofessional was a part of that, and she needed to ask questions because she was with that student all day long, and we were not. So if you're not getting the information you need, be sure to ask for it.
And I'd also like to clarify one last thing, and then I'll try to be quiet, but I have a hard time doing that. Behavior support plans aren't for kids that have behavioral goals and IEPs necessarily. Now, granted, if you have a behavioral goal on an IEP, you have to have a behavior support plan. But any student in your building can be put on a behavior support plan. And so I don't want to. I just want to make sure to clarify that. You can have an entire school building on a behavior support plan if you need to. Hopefully, they're going to be individualized so it meets everybody's needs. Because if everybody's on the same support plan, what works for you isn't necessarily going to work for me, like Sarah said. But I just want to make sure that you know that anybody at any time can have a plan, and as long as it's implemented with fidelity and we find the right function, it should work.
Moving on to slide 18, and I'm going to walk you through a case example of Billy. And I'm sure as I talk about some of these behaviors, most of you are going to be able to replace Billy's name with another student that you've probably worked with. So Billy kind of had 3 different categories of behaviors. He had some work refusal, so he would stop working, he would draw instead of do his work, scribble on paper, rip up paper, visit with peers and adults. He had some verbally inappropriate behavior. He was loud, he would swear, he would call names, argue, scream. He also had some physically inappropriate behavior. He would slam his desktop, spit, hit, kick, tip over chairs and desks, throw things, and run from the area. So that initial hypothesis, going to the slide 19, that the team thought that when the class is doing independent work, Billy will rip up his work and yell at the teacher in order to get adult attention. This is most likely to happen when he does not like the type of work. So again, their initial thought, their initial hypothesis was that Billy wanted access to adult attention. So then when we look at this initial data on slide 20, it's kind of hard to see, but if you look at the blue line, that would be Billy's compliance percentage. So the percent of time that he was compliant. And you will see that over this, it looks like 5 or 6 day period, his compliance rate went down. The red that's kind of more on the bottom is his ODR, so that's those office discipline referrals that would have been completed. And you'll see that that number went up. So his rate of compliance went down, and his number of referrals to the office went up. One of the things that I want you to remember here when we're talking about behavior plans, there's kind of a couple different rules when we're implementing a plan that we want to make sure that teams remember. One of those is that we need 1 month of consistent, appropriate intervention for every year the behavior is in place. 1 month for every year the behavior is in place. I know myself working in the middle school that sometimes that's a little bit frightening if we think about how long that we really need to, with integrity, put an intervention into place. Certainly it does not always take that long. But I really sometimes like teams to know that information because it's not going to happen overnight. It didn't take overnight for this behavior to get so significant. It's not going to be fixed and changed overnight. A second rule is 2 to 3 weeks before making changes to a plan. So just because in the first couple of days or weeks of implementation, you might not have good information, that doesn't mean, or good data, that doesn't necessarily mean that your intervention is not appropriate. Often we will see what we call an extinction spike. So in the initial time that an intervention is implemented, that behavior increases for whatever reason. Often that student is kind of maybe testing it out a little bit. Every time I behave this way, you're going to have this reaction. And so it's very common that the behavior is going to increase and get worse before it gets better. And we have to kind of work our way through that and continue to be consistent and to continue to implement that with integrity. Of course, any safety issues are going to change that 2 to 3 week kind of rule. If we move on to slide 21, when we look at the analysis, so that initial hypothesis was adult attention. You saw that initial data where the compliance rate went down and the office referrals was going up. So then if we went in and actually analyzed it, set up some conditions and tested out what each of that is going to look like. So this control condition that you see, the student would have a preferred activity with a preferred person there with them, providing what we call kind of that rich adult attention. So really just having fun. It's very common that we see no behaviors in there. The students doing something they like with somebody they like, having fun. That second one, that access, how that looks is they're doing that preferred activity, so whatever it is that they like to do, but now we've moved that preferred person away from them. So they can still do what they like, but that person is not there with them. So typically if we see behaviors here, it's to get that person's attention, whether they're looking at them or making comments to them. The escape condition, the student is asked to do some kind of activity that is more non-preferred. So if they don't like math, they may have a math task that they're asked to do. But that adult is right there with them, helping them out, answering their questions. So if any behaviors that we see at that time, it's because they want to avoid or escape whatever activity or task that they've been asked to do. So if you look at the data here in front of you for Billy, clearly there were more behaviors both times the escape condition was done. It looks like there was 4 the first one and 8 the second one. So if we think back, moving on to slide 22, if we think back to that initial function, the team initially thought that Billy was trying to gain access to adult attention. Clearly with our analysis data, it showed that he was trying to escape. So a new plan was put into place where Billy was not able to get out of the work. And you will see much different data when you look at this slide now, the slide 22. The compliance rate, you'll see initially, this is the blue at the top, you'll see initially that data went down. The compliance rate went down. And the red at the bottom, the office referrals went up. There is kind of that extinction spike. Often that behavior is going to get worse before it gets better. Cole and I know when we go in, we warn teams about that expect it to get worse. That doesn't mean you're doing the wrong thing. More often it means that you're doing the exact right thing, and you need to keep working with the student doing exactly the same thing. And as you see with this data, after that initial decrease, Billy's scores went up. His compliance rate increased. He was right up there at 95% at the end, and his office referrals went down. It looked like it was 0 at the end. So when they had this plan in place that was based on his function of escape, moving on to slide 23, then they were able to change their hypothesis and say that when the class is doing independent work, Billy will rip up his work and yell at the teacher in order to avoid the academic test. This is most likely to happen when it's a pen and paper demand or when he feels embarrassed. So when we look at some different strategies, when we look at like access strategies versus escape strategies, when we are looking at that access, so they want access to an adult or peers or some kind of item, we need to make sure that they do not have access to that preferred person, that preferred thing, unless they're engaging in appropriate and compliant behaviors. Sometimes we use daily charts or those kind of things to help track that. But it's very important that they only get access to those things when they're doing what they're supposed to do. When they're engaging in those challenging behaviors, then they don't get to be with those comfort people or in those comfort environments. When we look at escape, we need to assure that they are never allowed to escape that task, that environment, or that demand, that they're always expected to complete it. I know different times we'll set up an intervention that, for example, if a student is trying to escape math and they just are refusing to do that math task, then their day kind of freezes or their day kind of stops. You can take as long as you need to do this math task, but you're not moving on with the rest of your schedule until you've completed that math task. Certainly, we have had students push that up to 2 to 3 days, where they really are like, really, are you going to make me do this task? And it's very important that they complete that task that they were initially trying to. If they need a little break from it, that's fine, but you need to make sure that they never are allowed to escape that task or even that demand or that direction. So if the direction was to pick up the paper that Billy just ripped and threw on the floor, we need to assure that if that's the direction, if that's the demand that was given to them, that he needs to follow through with and comply with that demand and never get out of that. It looks like we do have a couple of questions or comments that Cole and I are going to address quickly. The first one was if it takes 2 to 3 days to accomplish the task, so we're talking about that escape, so that's that freeze situation, that freeze intervention that I mentioned. What happens to all the classwork and the other classes that they missed? Have they just won the battle of getting out of those classes too? Cole and I were kind of talking that back and forth before we came back on because there really is kind of two different ways to look at it, and it's really kind of based on what your biggest concern is. Is your biggest concern behavior, or are there some academic concerns too? In a lot of the situations that I've worked on or worked in where that intervention is that freeze, one of the things that we put in place in that is you need to complete the task that you initially were trying to escape, but you also need to complete some form of all of those tasks you may have missed. So certainly if it took 2 or 3 days, there might be some modification of what they might need to do, but they still need to have some kind of expectation. So if they missed reading class on top of their math class, there still needs to maybe be some reading tasks that they need to complete. Often we may have those behavioral students who academics is not a concern, and so you can certainly adjust to that. But I know that specifically I've worked with a student who I think it was 3, maybe a little over 3 days, where he dug in his heels and I am not doing this. I think it was a writing task, and I'm going to sit here. How long are you going to sit here was kind of his thought. But when he realized that he was going to sit in that desk looking at that wall day after day, it became very unpleasant. And he decided that it was much better to do this writing task and the math and reading that I may have missed and to get back into that environment. Kind of the key is to make that freeze situation kind of as non-preferred as possible so that it becomes a better option for them to get back in their class and to do their work.
And then my opinion would be, depends on the severity of the behavior. Oftentimes when we get called into schools, the next step is going to be an out-of-school placement. And academics really isn't the big concern, getting their behaviors under control. And oftentimes I'll tell teams that, like if we're looking at this, and this is November 13th, and they haven't had the opportunity to do anything for the first 12 weeks of school, giving me 10 days, or giving the team 10 days to work through this, because if the reason is to escape, and they're willing and able to escape for days on end, then we might not have the right function. And we need to really go back and look. As long as I've had anybody stay in and refuse to do work, it's 2.5 days, and they were the happiest kiddos in the world to get out and to function with their peers, just because of the escape behavior. And after the initial burst, we saw great gains over the next 4 to 5 days. It can happen, and I try to say, when I'm going in and working with kids and their behaviors, that's what I'm working with. Academics, of course, are very important, but if we need to get to the root of the problem, we need to take care of the behavior before we worry about the academics.
Absolutely. A follow-up question here talks about what if you don't have a consistent place to move the student? That's very important. Whenever I present that as an option for an intervention for a student, the first thing we need to talk about is you're going to have some resources or a location to put that student. And it's critical that that location is not stimulating. It's not a fun place to be. If we're just removing them to an environment that has lots of entertainment, lots of things to do, it's not going to meet our needs.
It is not the office.
There's lots of coming and going in an office. I know, going back to the student that I know held out for 3 days, he was in a cubicle. He looked at a wall. He had the sides of the cubicle around him, and there weren't other things. If he tried to turn around and look at something, he was immediately redirected back to looking at the wall. So it's very important not only to have a place to go that is non-preferred, but to make sure that they're not getting access to attention or to things. And it is difficult, and you have to be able to commit to that place, to commit to that intervention, or it's not going to be successful. Let us know if there's any other questions on that. Another one I see here was about the title. Is it our function or the student? Well, I think our goal of this was that we were talking about the function of the student. But as you have kind of heard Cole and I go back and forth, it certainly can be related to us. All of our behavior serves a purpose. So truly, when Cole and I are talking through things specifically on our slides, we're talking about the function of the student. But I know I certainly, when I have had other discussions, certainly can relate it to myself, you know.
And actually, that's a great segue into the next section I'm going to be talking about with universal strategies on slide 20, page 24. I am going to be specifically talking about us, what we can do in a large part of this. And going to 20, I need to catch myself up here. Page 25. I'm way behind. Never mind, I'll be right there. Sorry, the universal strategy. Go back. I'll get this straightened out. Take a couple minutes off, and I get confused here. Universal strategies. The following strategies can be used on a daily basis with students, regardless of their function of their behavior. And strategies we're going to be talking about don't necessarily have to be a behavioral issue kid. They can be with everybody. I think it's important to practice these strategies, these skills, so we do it on a consistent basis.
I practice them with my husband.
Now, some of you might realize if you've been trained in CPI, the nonverbal physical crisis intervention model, which many of you have because I've been the one to train you. You see names scroll down. These are taken directly off of the CPI website because a few of these slides are, because I think they're very, very important, and whenever I get a chance to reiterate them, I do. So if you've seen them before, it's going to be a great practice, and if you haven't seen them before, I encourage you to talk to your administrator and see if it's a possibility of you taking the CPI training. And no, I wasn't paid for that little comment. I'm a big believer in CPI. Personal space is often defined as an area surrounding your body which is considered an extension of yourself. And basically, that's 1.5 to 3 feet. You put your arms out; it's an arm's length away. Invasion of personal space may raise anxiety, and that can be done in several different ways. One way it could be done is, just thinking about good practical sense. If you see a student that's irritated or agitated about something, about making sure, like if they're sitting at a desk and you come up to them at a desk and you're blocking their exit from them, you're invading their space, and they don't feel like they have a way out. And if you're looking at the perception of fight or flight, if the student is agitated or irritated enough, and they have one or two different options, and either fight or flight, if you take away that flight area, then especially in your junior, senior high level, they might go to the fight aspect, push you out of the way to get out, to get where they need to go. If they need to escape, if it's an issue that's overbearing to form, they need to escape that area immediately. You might get a response that you're not asking for, and oftentimes we blame the student. In reality, it's our fault. We set them up in such a way that they had to respond that way. Another thing I want to talk about is when we talk about personal space, it's not just their desk per se. I'm talking about book bags, possibly their lockers, their personal possessions, even to the point of I've seen kids, if they're taking their shoes off at a certain place, put their boots on to go outside, and you move those shoes from one area to another, that can start to raise anxiety, start to get behaviors. And I know most of us that are clear thinkers can't understand how that could be a problem. But it's really an extension of themselves. A lot of the kids that we deal with, all their personal possessions might be in their book bags. It might be in their lockers. It might be that coat. That might be the most important sweatshirt that they have because a relative or a friend who's no longer with them gave it to them, and it might stink to high heavens. They wear it every single day. You can come up with a scenario, I'm sure, on your own. We can all have examples. And you try to take that away, try to what they would feel is as a control piece. You're really starting to raise kids' anxiety. So just be aware. If you're going to go look, if depending on your school policies, if you need to search through a locker, a student's locker, I always have that student there with me, just for safety reasons, to make sure that I want you to make sure that what I'm doing, or make sure that you know what I'm doing. I'm not taking anything, and this is specifically what I'm looking for. So. Moving on to the next page, factors of personal space. There are several different factors that in regards to how comfortable a person feels with personal space. It could also be one of the factors is size of the person. If you're 6'5" and you're dealing with kindergartners or first graders who are standing 3 foot tall, that size right there might be an intimidation factor that you need to take into consideration. Oftentimes when I'm working with kiddos in the elementary, I'll kneel down beside them if I feel like it's a safe environment. I don't think they're going to physically react or respond to me. I'll kneel down beside them. Or if it's a student that's sitting next to the lockers or maybe outside of a think room type area, and the environment's safe, I'll sit parallel to them and talk to them and get on their same level. Also, another factor in regards to personal space is your personal relationship with the student. If I walk in, if you're dealing with a child, Billy, on a day in and day out basis, I come into your school as a stranger and try to work with Billy. That personal relationship, it differs a great deal. Sometimes for the better if it's a stranger, but most oftentimes if they don't have a rapport relationship with you, then that personal space really differs. The environment you're in. The students feel much more comfortable maybe if they're outside of your environment, your personal space, your classroom setting, or if you're someone who always has lunchroom responsibilities or bus responsibilities, that can also be a factor. Gender. Some students, even some adults, respond better to a specific gender. A lot of kids, if you've had a bad experience with a parent, either male or female, that might reflect positively or negatively in a school situation. And you might not want to admit it at all, but hygiene is a huge factor as well. Let's be honest. If I stink, I'm not going to have a bunch of people hanging around me, asking me questions, and I'm seeing what's going on. You tend to distance yourself if somebody has poor hygiene. Another factor is your history with the student. Are you the counselor and also the disciplinarian? Are you somebody who is seen in the classroom as that iron fist type approach, or are you somebody who people feel like they can go and talk to and build a rapport and trust with? We all have responsibilities. I'm not saying one's good, bad, or indifferent within the school setting, but we do have our responsibilities, and if you've had an encounter with a student, your history might not bode well when dealing with personal space. And the last one to consider is culture. In the rural community, not so much, but more in, but we are finding it in different communities. Being aware of the cultural background, what their upbringing expectations are. Although they live possibly in a different setting now, we need to respect their culture and cultural differences. Some cultures, students, young people, youth are not supposed to give eye contact to adults. It shows a sign of disrespect. But yet in our culture, and I'm saying all of as in mine, um, I was I was brought up as if you don't give eye contact, it can be seen as disrespectful. So we just need to take those into consideration. If you have students that are moving in from a different cultural background, you know, a nice little thing called Google, it takes about 10 seconds, and you can get all kinds of information and really get yourself up to speed with where those students are. Next thing I'd like to talk about is body language. That's basically defined as nonverbal message transmitted by our body, posture, and motion. And the two biggest things I want to touch base on is our facial expressions and our gestures. Gestures by our hand gestures. Regardless of what we're saying, people look at the facial expressions, what our hand gestures. I do have a coworker, and it's not Sarah, who when I talk with this individual, that if they get excited, their hands move faster and faster. And quite honestly, I'm more enthralled with their hand gestures and making sure that she's not going to hit herself or hit something around her. I don't always hear what she's saying. I don't tell her that, but I mean it gets such excitable that you know, I myself, and I'm assuming I'm not the only one, that is into more of what she's doing with her hands than actually what she's saying. And it kind of goes on with what the research is at the bottom of the slide there has shown when we communicate. I know we'd all like to think that what we say is the most important thing, especially in a time of need with the student, but actually research says that 81% of what we say is shown through our nonverbals. 12% of what we say is how we say what we say. And only 7% are words that we are actually said, how we communicate. So 7% of tonight, hopefully is not the case, of what you're going to take away from this is not what we actually said. But since you can't say our nonverbals, and believe you me, it's difficult to give a presentation when I'm not in front of my peers, and being able to see their facial expressions, their gestures, kind of see if what I'm saying is working, not working. I'm staring at a screen and talking into a screen. It's actually really difficult. So this all brings it home to me.
And if we think about that body language, so those facial expressions and those gestures, and if we relate it back to function, it ties very clearly into that access function. There are a lot of students that we work with that simply giving them some kind of nonverbal communication, so some kind of facial expression, a gesture, or something, even just looking at them, is going to be rewarding enough to them. It's going to give them the access that they need. So I know a lot of times I will tell school staff when they're working with a student that wants that access to not be afraid to turn your back to them or to turn sideways, so that you're not giving them even your nonverbal attention.
And we've got a couple different slides here, not caring what the function of the student's behavior is when we're dealing with de-escalating, when we're dealing with a plan, some do's and don'ts on dealing with the student, regardless of what the issue is. We always need to show the student respect. I know it's difficult sometimes in sitting here at 5:30 at night and with no students around, nor have you seen students for the last hour and a half. It's easy to talk about, but not so easy in practice. We need to isolate the student if at all possible. They're going to lose access to their function a lot sooner if we're able to isolate them. We need to stay calm as staff. If that means taking yourself out of the situation and putting somebody else in there, another adult in there, then that's fine. As Sarah was talking a little earlier, I was thinking about consistency. We need to be as consistent as possible. And in the junior and senior high level, it's extremely difficult when you're dealing with, upwards to, if you're talking about all the paraprofessionals, and teachers that they deal with on a daily basis, you're talking upwards of 14 staff people that we need to try to be consistent with. Extremely difficult. Remember that a behavior that needs to be done consistently for 1 month for every year of behavior. Imagine how difficult that is to get everybody on the same page for a large amount of time when you're talking to the junior and senior high level. Another thing we need to do is enforce limits. If they're set, they need to be enforced. If not, then we're giving the wrong picture. And when I'm saying enforcing limits, that means if you're walking down the hallway and you see a student do something and you don't acknowledge that, positive or negative, then you're letting it go. And that's reinforcing the student. Well, it's okay to do that, especially around Cole, because Cole didn't say anything this time. So I can expect to see that behavior ongoing because I didn't enforce those limits. Clarifying, being specific. I know at times I can be long-winded, but when you're dealing with a child in crisis or a child who's showing a specific function that we're dealing with, we need to clarify and be as specific as possible, as quickly as possible. And the last one is listening. The student knows, you know if someone's listening to you, giving you time, not taking attention, giving that opportunity for to listen. And be honest with the student. If you don't have time right now to listen to them because they're in the middle of math class, you might start to see their function of escape. They're going to get listened to. So if you can't be the one to do it, find somebody who can. And the next slide, I want to talk about the don'ts. Don't overreact to a situation. Overreact to a specific function that the child is showing. I go back to a personal story of had an accident and had to go in and get stitches, and it was at the time I thought it was fairly severe, and I think it was. Looking back on it, but I just remember the calming effect that the nurse had when she was cleaning my wound, and if she would have been irate, if her facial expressions would have changed. I mean, she was a very practiced, professional nurse, and it really calmed me. If she would have overreacted and said, "Wow, I've never seen an accident like this before. That's terrible. I've never, you must have really, you really did a good one." My anxiety level would have really increased, and I probably wouldn't have been as calm. I don't know if I was calm or not. I don't think I was at the time. But she really helped me work through it because she didn't overreact to the situation. Don't be threatening to the students. The students, for the most part, especially the children we're talking about with the behavior aspect, they know the gray area. That's where they normally go to. They normally don't step over that gray area. They know what it's going to take to get out of your classroom. To get you away from them if they're trying to escape. They know how much attention to access before they're going to get kicked out of class unless that's what they're looking at. Not using jargon, being consistent and clear. And a lot of times jargon that can be misruled with what you're trying to intend isn't necessarily how they're picking it up. And so just be clear and concise and to the point. Personalize as much as possible. Maybe not saying, well, we at Cole Academy do not do blah, 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 blah. No, just say, hey, you know what, Billy? When we're in school between the hours of 8 and 3, this is it. This is the behavior expectations we have for you. Okay? And be as clear and concise as you possibly can to personalize them. Don't blame. There's no reason to blame anybody. That's just going to raise anxiety and point fingers, and we don't need a power struggle. We don't want to give false promises, and we don't want to raise voices. Oftentimes we think that raising voices is going to actually do something. Most of these kids that we work with on a daily basis, that's how they communicate at home. That's how they communicate with their friends. You raising your voice is nothing new. In fact, doing just the opposite, oftentimes you get such a better response, because then they slow down, they stop, they listen to see what you have to say. So you being calm, you might be the only person who's calm the entire day for them.
And often I've seen students kind of mirror and mimic a calm staff person that's dealing with them. If that person, sometimes I've even seen it go to that extreme. If they are just, extremely soft-spoken or extremely calm, then I've seen that student just kind of, even if they try to meet them in the middle, if they're that escalated and that agitated, even just kind of coming down a little bit, just because of that calming presence, it makes a huge, huge difference.
Next slide I want to talk about is precipitating factors. This is internal or external causes over which staff have no control. I normally for those of you who have been in my CPI training, this is where I get on my soapbox. Because the examples, if you'd like to type in some examples, that would be great. Some examples I want to talk about that I see on a pretty consistent basis. Factors of things that we have no control of. And basically what that definition is, is when Billy walks through those doors every single morning. These are things that have happened to him since they left that building the night before, and we have no control over. We might be able to put a bandage on some things and work through some things for 7-8 hours, but realistically, we're not going to be able to solve some of Billy's problems.
These are some of even those non-functions that I talked about earlier. Even some of those diagnoses that they come to the table with, that'd be an internal cause that we don't have any control over.
Some factors that we have no control over include fear, their personal fears when they leave the building. Sometimes that building, or the people in the building, hopefully it's not just the building, it's the people, connections, and relationships they have. It takes away that fear. And that's why we oftentimes see behaviors in school and nowhere else, because they feel safe. They can try to communicate their fears through behaviors, because that's how they know to do it, and they know they're not going to get beat. They know they're not going to punished by not having food, by some negative manner. Another example is a loss of power that they might factor, a lack of sleep. Decided to play Xbox till 2 in the morning. Imagine that. And then we expect them to get up and be chipper and, oh, by the way, have math done by 8:15 when they have to come in the building. Decorah, thank you very much. No breakfast, lack of sleep. Definitely no breakfast. I don't know of a school, by being proactive, I don't know of a school district that doesn't have a breakfast program in place, so that takes out that factor. I also know several schools that have a program that they might have a granola bar or some sort of breakfast bar to get them through the morning, because I know we don't like to think about it, but you couldn't imagine the amount of kids that we deal with on a daily basis, that their 2 meals a day come at breakfast and lunch. And when they leave that school building at 3:15 in the afternoon, they're not going to eat again until the morning. And if they do, it's some Doritos that they found at a friend's house or this or that. I mean, that's the reality that we deal with. And trying to put that put that out there and say, although I do realize that math and that your writing assignment is very important, if we look back at that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of basically we need to be able to make sure that we get sleep, that we have a shelter over our head, that we have food, is a bigger priority. And I talk with teachers, and not all of them agree with me, but because math is very important, I understand that, but so is getting food over the weekend. So I promise I wouldn't get on a soapbox, but I'll stop that. Another very good point is many different adults at the home or many different homes. Great point. Some families we deal with have multiple families living within the same residence. We all know, or at least my experience was with having little babies at home, you don't always get a full night's sleep. And I might, as a 7th grader, I might be the full-time babysitter, so mom and dad can go out and have a good time. Living in different homes, that's an excellent point that I need to write down. I know I've dealt with kids before, that it was amazing the child's behavior on Monday morning when they had visitations with one parent or the other, how they came back, and it was on a consistent basis. Every Monday that they saw this parent, you could almost guarantee that this is the reaction. And although we couldn't change that weekend, great, but we were prepared. Come Monday morning, what steps are we going to take to make sure that Billy has a good day? Another good point, lack of money. Sometimes I don't want to generalize this, but some families, some people that you deal with on a daily basis tend to lose their patience 3rd, 4th week of the month. They're a lot happier come 1st of the month through 14th, 15th, 16th. When they do have access to money, clothes and a bed. I mean, think about it. School just started 12 weeks ago. Think about all those kiddos that came to school with brand new white sneakers, blue tennies, running around. I look for the kids that don't have those new sneakers running around, and those are the kids that I try to identify and touch base with, because not only do I recognize that, all their peers know that they don't have new stuff. They don't have the new clothes. They don't have the cool stuff. And regardless of how bad they want it, the money that they have, their family has, is spent on other things besides their clothes. We talked about kids that have come from large families. They might be the 4th boy in the family, but guess what? You are wearing whatever your brothers wore before you, and that's that. A lot of different things. I said I wasn't going to get the soapbox, and I won't.
The one I want to address is the lack of parental participation and supervision. I know I've worked with a lot of different students who, their parent just doesn't show that interest or even that excitement over what they're learning or what they're doing in school. And so often, the people in the school environment are the only people who care about their performance, who care that they tried hard and got an A on that test. And so, that we can't control what goes on in the home environment, but if we know that student, needs our extra TLC to show that they do matter and that we do acknowledge that they have worked hard and that they have made a difference.
And the last factor I think everybody's probably thought of, and no one's actually said it yet, is medications. You know what? That is a great point. But if Billy shows up with or without medication, we need to deal with Billy. If we have avenues, if we know that Billy's not going to show up on Mondays without medication, maybe, just maybe, that we can work out something with the parent, and the nurse can give have that medication along the way on Mondays, or if we know they're going to run out. It is a factor, most definitely, but we need to deal with what we need to deal with. I want to thank everybody. We're not quite done yet, but I do for this area for participating in the precipitating factors. Oftentimes when we give a training, we'll have a group of 20 or 30 people. We can come up. I give them 5 minutes to write on sticky notes, and it's not uncommon to come up with 70 or 80 different precipitating factors, different things that we have no control of, and it just blows you away. I don't care if you're the largest school district or the smallest school district. We deal on some level with all the same precipitating factors. So.
And the fact that we're able to come up with such a big list gives me, makes me feel good, because then I know that the school people that I am working with, they're taking those things into account. We can't do anything about it any more than the child can do anything about it. But if we know that that's what they come to the table with, then I think that gives us just a clearer picture to be able to really put a proactive plan in place for that child's success.
So, back to paraeducator role.
Slide 31.
Slide 31. Hopefully we redefine and notice reasons for behavior, our function. And the three main functions that we talked about today, the first one is automatic, a lot of the sensory aspect, and the automatic is basically regardless of where they're at, they do that. And I'm not sure Sarah brought this up earlier. Some common ones that I see, maybe kids with tics, and some specific diagnosis, medical diagnosis that cause these automatic functions that we work through. Second one is attention function. That's trying to gain access. I call it attention. You can call it access, trying to get something. And the third one is escape, trying to get out of something. And that something doesn't always have to be academics. That could be a variety of different things. But those are the three main ones: the automatic, the attention, and escape. Second thing we talk about is collecting data. Oftentimes you're stuck in a role of collecting the data, and we talked about the ABC data. There's all kinds of different data that can be collected. We talked about the office referral data, file review data, any kind of supports that have happened before they were here, and segueing into the next bullet is providing that positive behavior support. And the fourth one being a part of the support team. Be a part of, or response team, be a part of getting those positive behavior supports in place, because more often than not, you're the one that's going to be taken care of.
Here, what really makes a difference. So at this time,
with that, we
without
have,
further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for this
short video. I'd like you to watch.
Here, what really makes a difference. So at this time, without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for this back to school.
Okay, I'm stopping here first. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm stopping it for a second. I just want to do a quick segue into this. This is a young man. I believe he's 11 years old. This took place at in Dallas, Fort Worth, at before school started, their teacher in service. And I believe there's, they'll say it, but I believe there's approximately 20,000 teachers, paraprofessionals, support staff in this Coliseum where this student is going to be talking. It's just a short video, but I just find it really inspirational, and
here, what really makes a difference. Makes a difference. So at this time, without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for this back-to-school convocation, Dalton Sherman from Charles Rice Learning Center.
Believe in me. Do you believe in me? Do you believe that I can stand up here fearless and talk to over 20,000 of you? Hey, Charles Rice Learning Center, do you believe in me? Come on, I can't hear you. That's right, they do. Because here's the deal. I can do anything, be anything, create anything, dream anything, become anything. Because you believe in me. And it rubs off on me. Let me ask you a question, Dallas ISD. Do you believe in my classmates? Do you believe that every single one of us can graduate ready for college or the workplace? You better, because next week we're all showing up in your schools. All 157,000 of us. And what we need from you is to believe that we can reach our highest potential. No matter where we come from, whether it's sunny South Dallas, whether it's Pleasant Grove, whether it's Oakville, or North Dallas, or West Dallas, or wherever, you better not give up on us. No, you better not. Because, as you know, in some cases, you're all we've got. You're the ones who feed us, who wipe our tears, who hold our hands, or hug us when we need it. You're the ones who love us when sometimes it feels like no one else does. And when we need it the most, don't give up on my classmates. Do you believe in your colleagues? Do you? I hope so, because they came to your school because they wanted to make a difference too. Believe in them, trust them, and lean on them when times get tough. We all know we kids kids can sometimes make it tough. Am I right? Can I get a amen? So whether you're a counselor or a librarian, a teacher assistant, or work in the front office, whether you serve up meals in the cafeteria, my favorite, or help keep the halls clean, or whether you're a teacher or a principal, we need you. Please believe in your colleagues and they'll believe in you. Do you believe in yourself? Do you believe that what you're doing is shaping not just my generation, but that of my children and my children's children? There's probably easier ways to make a living, but I want to tell you on behalf of all the students in Dallas. We need you. We need you now more than ever. Believe in yourself. Finally, do you believe that every child in Dallas needs to be ready for college or the workplace? Do you believe that Dallas students can achieve? We need you, ladies and gentlemen. We need you to know that what you're doing is the most important job in the city today. We need you to believe in us, in your colleagues, in yourselves, and in our goals. If you don't believe, well, I'm not going there. I want to thank you for what you do for me and for so many others. Do you believe in me? Because I believe in me. And you helped me get to where I am today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Walk around the whole thing. They all give you. Wow.
I'm amazed every time I watch that. The amount of courage an 11-year-old boy has is a lot more than I would have today to stand up in front of all those people and talk about that. But he makes some very, very valid points. Going on, we have 2 more slides left. The first one is going to be, actually slide number 33, is different websites. Some of the resources we talked about today came off of those. First one, icbs.org, we talked about. Behavioraldoctor.org, excellent. She is definitely a guru when it comes to behavioral information and has a lot of great ideas and thoughts. And actually, if you email her, she'll email you back if you have specific questions about an issue or a thought. She's good at emailing back. IFF CMH .org, and then our AEA one is also a resource. And then I also hope that with all these websites, you know, some can be great, but I talk to your core people for the AEA or your behavior specialist within your area. You know, if you have concerns about a specific issue and they're in your building, I think that's the first place I would go, is to try to, you know, at the team level, the building level, figure out what needs to be done with specifics, and then if it needs to go bigger and better than that and involve more people, then you can go from there with it. But these are just great resources. And the last thing I want to talk about today is a proverb. It's my favorite proverb out there, so I wanted to end with it before Sarah talks. If you've told a child 1,000 times to do something and they don't do it, it isn't the child, it is the slow learner. Basically, if you're doing the same thing over and over and over, and it's not working, we need to change what we're doing. We need to do something different because the child is not responding to us with what we're trying to do. So, and that's why we work in teams. We're not a bunch of individuals out there on islands. Hopefully, at the team aspect, somebody brought up, and I touched base on, that, you know, you're not always invited. And I'll be honest with you, of all the districts I work with, on occasion, paraprofessionals are invited to the meeting, if it's a one-on-one or if there's a specific reason. But I you know, if you feel comfortable talking to the teachers, to the administration about being a part of it, if you need support and you work in one of our districts, by all means, I'll toot your horn and say the significance of why you need to be there, especially if you're going to be dealing with this child on a daily basis. You need to be one of those people around the table that are setting up the plan, because you're going to have to implement it. And with that, if you have any other thoughts or anything, please type them in. We can chat back to you. And then Sarah's going to finish up by reading a couple things, and one of them some people are already thinking about is your paper that's going to be due. So I want to thank you very much for your time this evening, and have a good evening.
And I know, just to piggyback on Cole's, if you have any thoughts or comments that you're taking in, I am sure I speak for Cole when I say that if you guys, you know, you go home and tomorrow you go to work and you have some other questions or some other thoughts, either of us would welcome an email with questions or comments or anything that you might want to problem solve together. Both of our emails, I believe you can find on the website if you don't have access to it. I am going to second Cole, thank you for your time after hours to sit and listen to us. Let us know if there are any questions or anything.